Thank you for joining me today for Math Stations in Action Part 1. My name is Brittany Gehrig. I am a consultant for teaching and learning. Your facilitator and I are going to take you through this training today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just kind of for your information, this is Part 1. There is a Part 2. The Part 1 is going to consist of an overview of what math stations are and the different components that go along with it. And Part 2 is more of experiencing the math station, seeing those examples, seeing what it looks like to have a teacher table lesson. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. And we're going to begin by starting with an activity that your facilitator is going to take you through called 3, 2, 1. So what we're trying to find out is, where are you on this guided math journey? And so when I say guided math, I'm talking about that small group instruction piece that's part of your math block. So where are you on this? So your facilitator is going to give you a sheet that looks like this. And you will notice that on this slide that you should see 6 different statements. Your job is going to be to look at these 6 statements and decide to choose 3 of them that you say, you know what, I've got this about guided math. That is not why I'm here today. I'm already doing that in my classroom, and putting those 3 statements there. Then I want you to find 2 statements that you're like, I'm okay with this. It would be nice if I could find some more information on it, but I'm really okay with it. And then what is that one thing on that list that for some of you, you may say, that's what scares me about guided math, or for some of you, you're like, I'm not scared, which is great. But what that one thing, which is, I would love more information on that. So I want you to kind of think of it in that perspective. And so your facilitator is going to pause this webinar and take you through this activity and be able to take you through the whole sharing out process. So I'm your facilitator, please pause this, and then we'll return back. Okay, so I hope that you had an opportunity to find somebody who you don't always necessarily work with, or someone that you didn't even know, and got to know them just a little bit better, and you got to share out kind of what is that one thing. Whatever's on your one, that is your purpose for today. That's what you're wanting to get out of this training. So I want you to keep that in your mind as you go through this training. And it might not happen today. So it might not happen in Part 1 for you, but it might end up happening in Part 2. So just kind of keep that in mind and keep that as kind of your focus for today's training. So the objective for this training is that I can implement guided math and stations as an effective practice for differentiating math instruction. And the language objective is I can share spoken and written ideas to implement guided math and stations. So we always want to make sure that we have a little bit of research in our training, so that you realize that, we're not just making this stuff up. This is all backed by research. And this research is really kind of about the why. Why do we have this? And yes, that research is quite old. It's, this is from NCTM 2000, which I know we're in 2016. But I think it speaks well of kind of what our purpose is in the math classroom. So I want you to take a moment and just read on that and reflect on that. So how that speaks to me about math stations is that it is very important that we make sure that every student in our classroom grows. So we are expected to understand what they know, and then we're expected to challenge them and support them in that learning. And if we only teach whole group, who are we meeting? which students in your classroom is understanding that instruction or getting the most out of your instruction. It's typically those kids that are right there in the middle. So a lot of times we tend in whole group to teach to the middle. And what we know is that our class is not filled with a whole class that are all on the same level. We know that we have a variety of levels. So it is our job to make sure that every student in the classroom grows. And this is where guided math or that small group instruction becomes very important. It gives our kids that opportunity for us to see really what they know, what they don't know, and then help them extend that learning or nudge them just a little bit to either learn it well or maybe even challenge them to go even deeper. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is how do we do this with guided math today. So your facilitator is going to take you through our next activity, which is called Always, Sometimes, Never. And what you have your facilitator is going to give you a set of cards of Always, Sometimes, Never cards. There's 3 heading cards that state that. And then there's some statements. And you're going to work as a group, and y'all are going to decide, is this always true about guided math or small group instruction? Is this sometimes true, or is this never true? Okay, and so what I want you to make sure that you realize is that as you're reading it, you are interpreting it probably based off of your experiences. So just make sure that in your group, you are kind of justifying why you're choosing to put it in there. And I'm going to caution you, some of you are going to want to put it right in between 2 of those. I want everybody to be definitive of it's either always, it's sometimes, or it's never. So your facilitator is going to pause and facilitate this with you, and then we will return and we will talk about where we put these. Okay, so how we're going to do this is your facilitator is watching you, and I need for one person at your table to be in charge of the heading cards. So that one person is going to hold up the heading card that matches the statement card of where your group chose to put that statement. Okay, so and we're going to facilitate this way. Your facilitator may stop this in between each one, or may just let it continue. So it's really up to your facilitator how this works, okay? So here's the first statement. Guided math is one component of the math block. Whoever's in charge of the heading cards, hold up. Is that always true, sometimes true, or never true? Okay, so on this one, guided math is one component of the math block. That is definitely what we want to make sure that we have in our heads, that part of our math time, guided math is a piece of it. So we like to say, research likes to say, that would be always. But we may have some people in there that have sometimes. And so if you have sometimes the reasons might be, well, the intention is always to have guided math as one component, but life happens. The assembly that was a call that we didn't know about interfered with us actually getting to guided math. So with that said, it really depends on kind of those things that happen. Or, you know, I'm going to do guided math 4 days a week, but 1 day a week, I'm going to leave that for my time to assess my students, things like that. So the intention is, yes, it is one component of our math block, but we know that sometimes we have to be very flexible in that piece. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Guided math groups are fixed. Always, sometimes, never. So a lot of times when I give this one, we usually have a lot of people who say never. Guided math groups are fixed, and y'all say never. Because what we know about guided math groups are that we want them to be flexible. Where a kid lands at the beginning of the year does not mean that's where they're going to stay the entire year. It's going to be based on those observations, assessments, and so forth. And kids can move from one group to the next. So I always say that I was the teacher, the classroom teacher, who was doing guided reading in my classroom, and probably around I don't know, 12 years into teaching, my principal came down to me and said, hey, you need to start doing guided math groups. And I was going, well, what does that look like in math? And there were a lot of things that I did and tried to do, but what I found about guided math groups, because they're not fixed, is that the math concepts versus reading seem to change more often. So my groups seem to change more often because of the difference in the concepts. And that kids that sometimes were really high in numeracy ideas were a little bit weaker in the visual spatial. So there was this fluidity among the groups a lot more often than necessarily they were in reading. So it made it a little bit more difficult in making sure that get those groups correct, and making sure that I was changing those groups during the time that I needed to. So let's look at the next one. Each guided math group has a different lesson. Always, sometimes, never. So usually a lot of times I have kind of a mixture up. I have some people who say always, and I have some people who say sometimes, and I might even have a never in there every time. So what was intended for this one is, when we say that each guided math group has a different lesson, what we don't want is for a teacher to think that every time they meet with a different small group that you need to come up with a different lesson. What we want is for you to come up with a lesson that you can differentiate for the different levels. So when we're talking about guided math, we are talking about that time where we are reinforcing what we're teaching in whole group. So if we're teaching three-dimensional shapes in whole group, then our guided math lesson is going to be on three-dimensional shapes. And that's important to note. So, because we're not using this time as a time for gap filling. When I say that is, a lot of time people say, well, I use small group instruction, but I typically do it because I'm filling gaps. When we talk about guided math, it's not about gap filling at this time. It's really about taking what we are working on and figuring out what kids know and what they don't know, and trying to correct those misconceptions right then about the content that we're teaching right then. When I talk about small groups with gap filling, I'm usually typically thinking about the RTI time. So that separate time in the day that you might have for gap filling. So what I want to make sure is that we do not walk away here thinking that every time I meet with a different group that I have to have a different lesson. I really want us to know, how do we take the same lesson and differentiate it for the different levels? Because I always say this in this training, is that if that was the case and you had four different groups, and you met with them, let's just say you met with them every day, and I'm not suggesting that, but you met with them every day, that would be, you would be doing 20 different lessons. If you did it 5 days a week, you'd be doing 20 different lessons plus 5 whole group lessons. Okay, y'all would pack your bags and you would be done. with the teaching profession. And that is definitely not what we want. So we really want to learn how to use the same lesson, but differentiate it for the different levels. Okay, here's the next one. Guided math groups are made up of 3 to 5 students. Always, sometimes, never. So this one I always have always, and I usually have sometimes. So my always people, y'all are stating research. You're exactly right. Research suggests that guided math groups are made up of 3 to 5 students. My sometimes people, they're stating reality, because what they know is that they have this perfect class of 20 students, and there's 4, and let's just say they have this 20 students and they have 4 groups and 5 kids are in each group. And then they hear a knock at the door around October, and this knock, and they've got a new student. Now I know none of you out there is going to say that, tell that student, I'm sorry, you cannot come in here because I've got my groups perfect and I cannot go over 5. So what you're going to do is say, yes, you can come on, and you're going to make a group of 6. But what we're going to be very mindful of is that we're never going to go over a group of 6, because once you go over a group of 6, you have a small class, not a small group. So just remember that. And then, but we can go the other way as well, because there's been years where I've had a group of 2. So because there was such a difference in the levels, whether it be that they were much higher than the rest or they were a lot lower than the rest. So a group of 2 is okay as well. So let's not get stuck on it has to be 3 to 5. We can be flexible in that. So we have some people who are stating research, and then we have some people who are thinking, well, I know what I have to do at times. And so that's perfectly fine. During guided math, a student works with a partner or small groups. So on this one, I always have kind of a variance, always and sometimes. And when we think of guided math in small groups, we typically think of students working with a partner or a small group. But I want you to be mindful that during this time, a child can work by themselves as well. Now, what I say for that is, everything shouldn't be by themselves. We do want them communicating with each other. We do want them working collaboratively with each other. But there are times where I might have a station that is an independent station, and that is okay. All my stations aren't going to be independent, but some of them are. And I might, when I work with them in a small group, instead of working them together collaboratively, I might be working with them one-on-one. So working independently is definitely something that can be done during guided math. And here's the last statement. During a guided math lesson, students are doing most of the talking. Always, sometimes, never. So this one typically sometimes it gets a variance and sometimes it doesn't. But before I discuss this is what I want you to remember. During small group time, this is the time for you to get to hear what the students understand, or what they don't understand, or what misconception they are making in their heads. If I meet with a small group and all I do is repeat what I did in whole group, even if I just tell them one more time, that's not going to help them. We have to make sure that kids are doing most of the talking, because they need to be explaining what they understand, what they don't understand, so that we can hone in on that and either help nudge them further along or help them with those misconceptions. So the kids should be doing most of the talking. Now, I know some of you are going, but what about that really low group? What if they just won't say anything? So I totally understand, but this is what I say. if I walked into your classroom and you were working with a small group, it might look as if you are doing more of the talking than the kids. But what I would make sure of is that it was in the form of questions, not just restating what you've already said. You've already had that chance. That didn't work with them. They need more. I need to figure out what it is they know and don't know, or what misconception they've constructed. So I have to ask lots of questions to get that to come out. So the idea is, yes, students should be doing most of the talking. It shouldn't be me. But if it's your lower group, it might be in the form of, you might be doing more talking, but it would be in the form of questions. So that activity is wrapped up in this slide right here. What is guided math? It is one component of the math block. Students learn in small, flexible groups based on readiness. Students practice with the teacher, with each other, and by themselves, so that's okay. Guided math groups, research states 3 to 5 students. Reality states something different. There's always a specific goal in mind. So every time I'm meeting, I know what that goal is, and that goal is typically the same goal that was for our whole group instruction that day. The students are doing the math, not me. I've already had my opportunity. I need the students actually doing the work. Lots of questioning is occurring, whether it's by me or whether it's by the students. They are used to scaffold the learning. So what we mean by that is we want you to try as much as possible to try to use the same lessons and materials. Just ask different questions, adjust the product. So that we can use that same lesson, so you're not creating a lot of different lessons for this. So there are 5 essential elements of guided math that are very important. And the first one is that it's data driven. We know that it has to be data driven because we can't get our groups. We won't know what we're focusing on. It is based on data. It is differentiated. That's the purpose of it. It's so that we can differentiate it for those different levels. Of course, it is standards-based. This isn't a time to go off of our standards. This is a time to teach our standards more in depth than what we typically can in a whole group situation. It is academically rigorous. Now, I know as all of you, I know you love that word. Rigor. I know it's overused and you're probably snarling your noses and, looking at that going, oh, if I have to hear that one more time. But what I want to make sure that we understand is, what does that mean, academically rigorous, especially when we're talking about guided math? Okay, so I want to make sure we know the difference between rigor and harder. So I always use this example. If I have a 1-step word problem and I make it 5 steps now, so I add things to it to make the kids do 5 different steps, I have not added any rigor to that problem. I have made it much harder, but I haven't added rigor. But if I take that single step word problem and my kids work it, and then I ask, it's not necessarily about the answer, but I ask, well, how did you do that? Explain your thinking. How can you represent using a model, communicate, justify how you know that is correct? How does that relate to what we've already learned? If you're asking those types of questions and your activities are bringing those types of things out, then it is academically rigorous. So rigor and harder are not the same. So making sure that in our math stations that we add some rigor, we add questions like explain your thinking, discuss what you did, communicate your thoughts, create a representation of what occurred at your station, different things like that, then you are adding that rigor that you need. And the 5th thing is it has to be engaging. And y'all all know that, because if math stations are not engaging, when don't have everybody's attention, then we know what's going to happen. They're going to be hanging off your ceiling. So the next question comes to forming these guided math groups. So we have to start somewhere because we have to actually form the guided math group. So what do we use to form guided math groups? So I want y'all just to take a moment, and we're not going to pause it, but I'm going to I will stop talking for you to sit there and kind of reflect. What is it that you already have that you use to form guided math groups? So some of you may have thought about this. A lot of times we have access to pretest. Any type of formative assessment techniques that you are aware of or that you use in your classroom can be used. So the 3, 2, 1 and the always, sometimes, never, both of those are formative assessment techniques. They were informing me kind of where you are on this guided math journey, or your facilitator, where you are on this journey. Any type of performance task. So if you have access to performance tasks, those are very nice and can help you form guided math groups. But this is one that I want y'all to remember that you have, and that is just the observation that you make. You know your students best. You're the one who's in with them day in and day out. That assessment, that paper pencil assessment, is not the only thing that tells you what your students know. So I want us to make sure that we realize that we can use observation to form guided math groups. Now, what your administrators want to make sure that you're doing is that you have something to back that observation. So you have notes. You need to make sure you're great at note keeping so that you can say, well, on this day, this is what I saw so-and-so do, and be very descriptive. So if they came and said, well, this assessment shows this, but you have them in this group, like that doesn't match, you're able to bring out, but every time in class, this is what I see. And you're able to verbalize that to your administrator. So observation is huge. It also gives us, the other nice thing about observation is it tells us that we don't have to wait until we take a paper pencil assessment to change our groups. If we see that a kid is in the wrong group, we need to change it. Don't wait till that next assessment to change it. We need to change it, and we can base that off of our observation. Anytime that you can confer with students, that's always important with forming guided math groups. So taking that into account is very important. And the last thing, if you have access to any type of diagnostic task. So these are just a plethora of things that you can use. You can use one, you can use all, however it works, but remember that a paper pencil test isn't the only thing that you have to use to form a guided math group. So when we're forming those guided math groups, we kind of have to be able to think about our students in those groups. And so this is a way to think about your students when you're examining that work. Again, whether that is I'm examining my observations or I'm actually examining paper pencil work. So we have our groups like this. So if we have our novice students, those are those kids who just do not have a basic understanding. You're looking at it and going, oh, yeah, I'm not real sure where they came up with that. Then you have your apprentice students. These are kids who have a basic understanding, but they really struggle hard on being able to reach at a deeper level. Then we have our practitioners. Those are people who are working on grade level. So those are kids who are doing exactly what you're asking them to. And then we have our experts, those who are working above grade level. So these students are typically doing things that you're not asking them to do. So they're going above and beyond where they even need to be. So what we're going to do is your facilitator is going to pause this webinar and is going to take you through an activity where you are actually going to sort some student work. So when you're sorting it, you're going to sort it in these 4 groups. You're going to find who are my novice students, who are my apprentice, my practitioners, and my experts. Most of the grade levels have 4 to 5 student work samples. Everybody in here has novice, apprentice, practitioner, experts. First and second grade, you actually have a whole class set of student work. So keep that in mind, that you're going to be looking at like 18 pieces of student assessment and putting them in there. So make sure it's going to take first and second grade a little bit longer to do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, facilitators, if you will pause this and take them through this activity, please. Okay, so I hope that you had a chance to sort your work and justify why you put the kids where they did, like what were those defining characteristics that really depicted them from being a novice and an apprentice. So I'm going to share those results with you. Remember that this is somebody else's opinion, so it is very subjective, so it might not look exactly like yours. What you need to be focused on is thinking about, were you just like one level off? And if you are, please do not worry about that, because I'm sure that you can justify why you have it in either places. Now, if you have somebody in the novice who is an expert, or an expert who we're saying is a novice, then that might be something that we need to talk a little bit more about, okay? So here are the answers to grades K through 2. I'm gonna give you all a moment to look at this. Okay, next is going to be 3 through 5. Okay, so if your facilitator needs to pause this webinar so that y'all can discuss a little bit more, you can, or we are going to go ahead and continue on through this. So this brings us to what we know is kind of, where does this guided math and math stations fit in a balanced math program? We know we need to assess our kids so that we can form those groups before we can really do anything else. We kind of know what that we want to see. That's different components of guided math, but where does this fit in a balanced math program? So this is a suggestion. These percentages can definitely be shifted in one direction or the other. The percentages are there because typically it depends on how much time you have. So some people have 90 minutes for math, some have 75, some have 60. I even have some that has 45. This pretty much though says these are the components that need to be in a balanced math program. So what we say is that 10% of our time should be done on some type of numeracy activity. And this can be the number of the day, it can be doing a number talk, lots of different things that you can do for numeracy. 10% of the time needs to be focused on some type of problem of the day. So this is that time of really taking those kids through the problem solving model and being very explicit in our teaching of the model. 20% of the time is devoted to a whole class mini lesson. So this is when we're doing our whole class. So again, if 20% you're like, that's not enough time, make it 30%. It's okay. We'll steal that time probably from math stations. 50% of the time is what we say for math stations or guided math groups. And then 10% of the time should be some type of share time. So let's make sure that on that 10% share time, that's a very important time for your students. It's a time to hold them accountable for what they did at stations. It's a time for them to be able to share out maybe what you heard in small group that you think hey, everyone needs to hear this. So that share time is really important, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of my experience. I knew that it was important, but if I'm with that very last group and I needed a few extra minutes, I tended to steal it from my share time. So knowing that is very important, I had to kind of shift my thinking and keep continuing to steal it. So what I did is I decided, okay, if I steal my share time during guided math, I have to have a backup plan. I have to have another time during the day to share. And so I typically said that I would then share either at the end of the day as we're lining up to go home, or while we're at the restroom, or we're lining up for recess. There were different times during the day that I said I would make sure and give time for kids to share. So it is an important time, but I do know that when you're with that last group and you need a few extra minutes, that's typically where I stole it from. Okay. So when we're talking about math stations, and these are going to be the math stations that you're going to get to experience in part 2, the math stations that I had in the classroom had a fluency station, so I have examples of that, a problem-solving station, a vocabulary, literature, and journal station, a digital station, and every now and then had a content-specific station. You notice it says optional. What that meant is when I had taught geometry and I wanted to spiral geometry back into my stations, they didn't really fit in any of those areas. So I had a geometry station. Didn't have it all year. It wasn't one of my normal ones, but when I needed to spiral it back in, I created the geometry station. I did the same thing with the concept of measurement. Those just didn't fit in the others, but they're important, and I wanted to make sure and reiterate some of the skills that we had, so I put it there. The last thing that we're going to talk about today is this idea of organizing and managing these stations. This typically a lot of times is where some of us get a little nervous about, is how do we organize all these materials and how do we manage our students during this time. So your facilitator is going to take you through a jigsaw activity. So they're going to pause this and they're going to take you through this activity. But what's going to happen is you're going to number off at your table in just a minute when your facilitator tells you to, 1 through 4. And then all of the 1s are going to go to one poster, all the 2s to another, 3s, and so forth. And y'all are going to become the experts on that poster. When you are, and your facilitator is going to have some focus questions that you need to make sure and have answered while y'all are at that poster, and then you're going to come back to your tables and you're going to share out at your table about your poster. And then we will come back together as a whole and debrief, and then we will kind of then wrap up what we've talked about today. So if my facilitators will pause this webinar and we will continue in just a few minutes. Okay, so hopefully you all had a chance to debrief the different posters and become experts on those. A lot of people on that common behavioral concerns and suggested consequences. Those behavioral concerns are those typical behaviors that a lot of times we see in stations. The suggested consequence I want to talk about though and focus on is that Station Academy. That Station Academy is for when you have taught your procedures so well at the beginning of the year and then something happens mid-year. Maybe it happens in October, maybe November, and they act as if they've forgotten what they're supposed to be doing. The Station Academy is a time for you to reiterate what those procedures are that we had learned at the beginning of the year. It's not suggested that everybody go through the Station Academy. It's only for those that look as if they have forgotten what they're supposed to be doing. So I like that consequence because I think that one's important, again, to reiterate those rules and procedures. Number 2, student accountability. We have to come up with some type of accountability, whether that's an exit slip, whether that's talking in an iPad and recording themselves. Whatever it is, kids need to be held accountable for what they are doing at that station. It does not mean they have to do something paper pencil. It could be them recording themselves, explaining something that occurred at their station. Anything that you can do that will prove that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. We have to hold them accountable at those stations. When we're thinking about those rules, possible rules for student-led activities, we know that we have to come up with some rules. We can do that with the students. We don't want more than 3 to 5 at the most rules. So it's not about this whole list. It's just about some of those basic generic rules. The rules that you already have in your classroom probably will work fine for this, but there might be a special rule for just station time. So kind of think about that. And then the last thing is really organizing and managing those materials and selecting signals. So anytime that you can have the materials nicely kept in one area, in one container, that is always very helpful. It's also very helpful to make sure that you teach the kids how to clean up. I know that in my years past, I've had the messy class and I've had the clean class. And so the messy class, it took a long time for us to realize that when you are finished, that you have to put everything back where it goes. And so that, again, is something that we train our kids on what that should look like when you are picking up. Selecting signals. If our focus is on that small group, then we need that focus to stay on that small group, and we can't be bombarded with all the kids coming up with and asking lots of questions. So we have to come up with some type of signal so that we are able to communicate without interrupting that whole group. So hopefully you got some good ideas for that. So I'm going to leave you today with this quote that I want you to think about. Just kind of, why is guided math so important? So I want you to take a moment and read this. So when I read that, I'm just like, oh, that just 2/3 of the children are wasting their time if all we do is teach to that whole group. It really is our job to make sure every kid is growing. So we have to do this. This is very important. It's very important that we're meeting our kids where they are and nudging them appropriately. So with that said, part 2 is going to be where we actually experience the station. So in part 2, you're going to see examples of stations. You're going to see examples of the fluency, the problem solving, vocabulary, literature, and journal, the digital. You're going to get to see examples of those, and you will have access to all of those. And then also we're going to see, what does a whole group mini lesson, what could it look like? What does a teacher table activity look like? So those are the type things that we're going to be doing in part 2 that you and your facilitator will take you through for part 2. So I hope that you had a great day. My name is Brittany Gehrig. So if you have any questions for me, brittany.gehrig@regenten.org, please feel free to email me. Your facilitator is going to give you a link to a Google form to fill out for your survey. And I look forward to being with you again for part 2 of Math Stations in Action.